Okay, welcome to our last survey talk of this year's interspeech. The survey talk will be given by Alejandrina Cristia. Cristia is a senior researcher at the CNRS in Paris and director of the Laboratory of Cognitive Science and Psycholinguistics there. Her research interests look at the linguistic and especially phonetic phonological representations that infants and adults have, how those are formed, and how they fit in with other cognitive sciences. Most recently, she's received an ERC Consolidator Award for the X-Elang project. And she's going to be talking to us today about child language acquisition studied with wearables.
Hello, everyone. This is a trial run for the talk I'll be giving at Interspeech, a survey on child language acquisition studied with wearables. So what are wearables? When we think of adults, often we think about smartwatches or smartphones, something that you carry with you. Today, I'm going to be talking mostly about these audio recorders, not the one that's on a police officer shown here, but the other one which you can barely see that's worn by a child. I will be saying just a few words about the use of head-mounted cameras for child language acquisition understanding. And so you see some examples of this other technique here. And in terms of wearables, we can also think about other types of devices that capture other things that are not speech or visual signal, such as the Outlet Smart Sock, which is an industrial application which tracks children's heart rate and sleep. So overall, these wearables are there in order to enable data collection in normal situations. So I will say just this, I will just show you this slide in multimodality because it's a domain that I feel has, in terms of the speech technology, has made less progress so far than the audio part. But if you're interested, there are already some databases that you can start working on. And I'm giving you links to two of them, the SACAM dataset, which is a longitudinal dataset with 3 children, and the seedlings dataset, which is less dense than the SACAM, but it has more children, 44 children who were followed between the middle of the first year up to the middle of the second year of age. Another thing you can see is that in the seedlings case that's shown here, they actually had 3 cameras. Two of them were actually on the child's head and the other one was on a corner. And so this gives you 3 points of view on the sea. If you're interested in multimodality, this year there's a version of the Zero Resource Speech Challenge that I'll be talking about towards the end of this talk on visually grounded training. So you can check this out as well. I'm afraid this will be all I'll be talking about in terms of multimodality. So now let me tell you more about these wearables that collect audio. And in particular, they collect them in this that we call long form. Typically, these recording devices collect data for 4 to 16 hours of continuous data. In fact, the latest models actually collect 24 hours on one go. Some of them can actually go further than that. The limit actually comes from the battery time. And so basically, when you're collecting data with a wearable for this amount of time, participants just go about their daily activities and they don't necessarily need to do anything special. And of course, at the end, you're just going to recover your regular audio files. And there's quite a bit of literature that can explain you more about this technique if you're interested in collecting this data. So they have been really revolutionary in the field of language acquisition because they allowed actually easier coverage of a more widespread number of populations that had been looked at in the past. And so here I'm showing you examples from 3 communities. At the top, the Chimane in Bolivia, in the middle, the Yihuan in Namibia, and at the bottom, a family from Papua New Guinea. This means that we can actually collect data where children are, wherever they are, and really try to get an unbiased view of how they hear the world and how they speak about it in their everyday life. With some colleagues, we have postulated that actually this kind of technique is ideal for documenting language environment and language development. And in the paper that's cited here, we compare it to long observations by third parties, parental reporting, and short audio-video recorded observations. I think in the context of this talk, the only thing, and you're interested in speech technology, the only one that would be interesting is the last one, so shorter audio video recordings. In fact, one thing to bear in mind is that when you do these shorter video recordings, you have to choose what kinds of context you're going to use. Whereas with these long-form recordings, you're actually going to sample from all the contexts that the child actually lives throughout the day. So from the moment they wake up, their breakfast routine, if they go out, to the time they go to sleep. So all of these contexts are sampled, whereas in a shorter recording, you have to choose which one. These shorter recordings also lead to greater participants' awareness. And this is something that's particularly in the seedlings dataset became very obvious. And so if you're concerned about ecological validity, then definitely the fact that participants are very highly aware that they're being observed might really change the way they behave. Okay, so you can check out the other three. I'm not going to go into detail into those. So why is it so important to look at language in this ecological way? Well, because we actually want to find out how language is learned in the real world and not just in these perhaps artificial situations. And so in order to facilitate the exposition today, I'm going to imagine a very simple model of language learning, which occurs as the child applies some kind of learning function on the input that's provided to the child. And as they grow older, they will start producing speech, and that might also be both a signal of how much they learn and a way in which they learn. And so when I talk about this process, very often the people I'm talking to are from Europe and North America, and they say, yeah, of course, parents teach language to children. We will sit and explain to them what are the names of different things, and we'll demonstrate some verbs and actions and so on. And this is a very common way of thinking about how language is learned. Language is taught in this context in a way. It's taught by the caregivers. In reality, when you go out of these Eurocentric and American-centric views of conceiving the family, what we see is that actually children learn language probably by applying learning functions to their input. That part is the same. But this idea of the caregiver actually teaching language to the child, particularly very small children, seems to not be necessary, at least in across populations. And so very often when we look at, for instance, traditional populations, we see it's not uncommon for infants to be cared for by slightly older children. And so already this idea of the adult sitting down playing with toys with a baby might not be very common in other places. And so one thing we might want to wonder is it the case that there are differences in the kinds of input that children are exposed to across these two types of population? And so in some work, I actually did a systematic review of behavioral observation. So this is when people go and actually watch who's talking to the child. I remember I talked about the possibility that this actually has lower ecological validity. And so based on these 60 years of papers reporting on child-directed speech and other such behaviors, I estimated that urban and rural populations actually differed quite a lot in terms of how frequently adults or anyone talk to children. And this difference was about threefold. So if we think that children are learning language by extracting something from their input, then it would sound like children growing up in urban settings have a lot more input and perhaps a lot more adult input to use than children in rural settings. Now, this was based on behavioral observations, but I think it would be important to check with methods that have higher ecological validity. So this is where long-form recordings become really, really useful. The first thing we need to do with these long-form recordings, since now you have 10 or 15 hours of continued audio, is simply try to create a training set to have a first idea of what happens in these 15 hours, and also to be able to train tools to do this automatically later. And so here I'm showing you the sampling design from Melanie Soderstrom and colleagues in the Ecole project. What they did is they pulled out 2-minute clips at 15 different points of this long-form recording, this 10-15 hours, and they did this for 10 children in each of the corpora that they had. That means that the part that they annotated is very small compared to the whole data set, but I'll explain in a moment why. So when they say annotate, what does that mean? Well, it means at the very least that we make a decision as to when the child is vocalizing. So here I'm showing you the child is vocalizing over here, as well as when other people are vocalizing. Here we see 3 vocalizations by a female adult, which is numbered 1 in this particular case. If the child is vocalizing, people in the Ecole project further made a decision whether this vocalization was crying, laughing, or speech-like. And if it was speech-like, they made a decision whether it was a real word that meant something or not. And if it was something meaningful, they decided whether it was a sentence that had more than one word or just one word. In this case, it's just one word. When someone else talked, they actually transcribed what the person said. And in addition, they made a decision whether the speech was addressed to the key child or whether it was addressed to someone else. When you look at it like this, it seems really simple, but in reality, it takes a very long time because this audio signal, as you can imagine, is quite challenging. People go about their day, that means they're in different kinds of auditory environments, and some of the speech is actually far afield because the device is actually worn by the child, but not other people. And so actually coding just 2 minutes takes about 1.5 hours works just for the first pass. And then you also need to check and have a second reliability pass. And so to build their corpus, actually, Sorsham et al. Took about 3 years. So it's a very, very time-consuming effort. We also know that this is very hard because of the way in which annotators agree or disagree between them. So what I'm showing you here is an analysis done by Marisa Casillas. And what she did is she compared actually two annotators. These two annotators actually have exactly the same level of training. In fact, main annotators for one child might have been secondary annotators for another child. But they differ in terms of how much information they have. So the main annotator saw all the 15 2-minute clips for that child, whereas the secondary annotator only saw 1 minute for that child. So they have a lot less information. And so what you'll see is actually the proportion of disagreement is far from negligible. In particular, if you notice the disagreement with respect to the key child, who's actually near field, about 19% of the frames that the secondary annotator attributed to the key child were not considered speech by the main annotator. Some of this has to do with the difficulty of perfectly segmenting the speech, so just what we often call the color. But in part, this has to do with a disagreement in terms of what counts as speech, because the key child actually produces vocalizations that might not be speech-like, or clearly crying or clear laughing. So this is very, very challenging data. So it's even so, it's very interesting to see their first analysis based on this human annotation to try to see whether these threefold differences I was finding in previous research looking at systematic observations hold. And so since they have 5 different corpora, we can actually ask that question. What you see here is each line is a corpus that was in this Ecole project. And the number here indicates the minutes per hour of speech directed to the key child, the child who was wearing the recording device. Notice that the mean is actually not necessarily representative of the whole distribution. For instance, for North American English, the range actually goes from 0 minutes to 10 minutes. So some children actually in this 30 minutes had been annotated, this is 15 2-minute samples, had no speech addressed to them at all. Okay, so now looking at the averages, however, what we see is quite a bit of overlap between children who are urbanites, growing up in urban environments, and children who are growing up in rural environments. Counter what I had found in this systematic review of behavioral observations, which is an issue I will come back to in a moment. Even though these means are quite similar, we do see quite a bit of variation across individuals and across populations. And this is spelled out a little bit better in this graph. Each one of the points you see here is one individual child grouped into the different corpora: North American English, UK English, Argentinian Spanish, Celta, and Yelinia. And these are grouped, voices have been separated into women, men, and children other than the key child. So all of this speech is speech addressed to the key child. So one thing that should be obvious to you is that there's quite a bit of variation in terms of how much adults speech children get across cultures, and how much child speech they get across cultures. For instance, if you focus on Yelinie, actually half of the speech that they get comes from other children and not from the female adult. And this is important for evaluation, as I will say in a moment. So basically, so far, what we find is extremely different results when we look at behavioral observations versus long-form recordings. And we don't know whether this is a problem of the technique. Perhaps when we do long-form recordings, we can actually capture speech that the observer missed, or perhaps the presence of the observer gets people behaving differently. It's unclear. The other problem that I can imagine some of you are saying is that we have a problem of estimation accuracy, right? Perhaps some of you will say, I just don't believe that the child will get no speech. This has to do with the fact that only 30 minutes have been annotated for every individual child. And so a priority now is actually to develop speech technology tools to actually generalize to the unobserved, the 97% of each recording that has not been annotated, and to the many, many other annotations that have recordings that have no human annotation. So maybe since what we're doing so far is deciding who talks when and when it's child-directed speech, well, maybe we can use some off-the-shelf tools. In reality, this won't work, and this is something that they've been working on for the last few years. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you how well IBM's Watson does with one of the clips that have been extracted from these long-form recordings. This clip was chosen because it was relatively clean. It has a lot of speech, and so it's actually a good example of a place where we should find good performance. And what you'll see on the left-hand side is the human transcription. So whenever you see chi, that means that it's the key child speaking, and whenever you see mod, that means that it's the mother speaking. And on the right-hand side, you will see the transcription by Watson. And I chose Watson because it's one of the few tools that actually tries to do talker diarization at the same time as trying to do ASR. Okay, so let's have a listen.
Ja, ich höre Pipi.
All right, Ray, sit on the pee-pee pot. Oh, pee-pee pot time. Yeah. Yeah, we gotta sit on the pee-pee pot. Oh, no. Ow, you just hit me in the mouth.
Okay, I like ending there because it got that very last sentence, which is low frequency, perfectly right, almost. But if you were paying attention, you probably noticed that the key child actually was attributed to 4 different speakers. And when the mother spoke, the first time she was missed, she was far afield, and so perhaps that's why she was missed. And then the second time she spoke, she was recognized, but she was recognized as one of the speakers that had already been used with the key child. So this is a complete mess. And so if we try to use any of this, even for the speaker diarization phase, we'll actually be relying on very, very noisy data. So, so basically, at this point we stopped and we said, what do we absolutely must develop for these research questions? Maybe we can do something that's less complex than ASR, since ASR does not seem to be possible at this point. So at the very least, we want to quantify adult or more generally input speech, adult or other children. We want to distinguish from that speech which part is directed to a child versus overheard, because perhaps the stuff that overheard is less useful for the key child. And basically, we want to quantify and, if possible, describe children's speech, the key child, so the child who's wearing the recording device. In addition, since we're interested in language acquisition across the world, including in places that are quite different from the urban sites that are typically studied, we need these tools to work at scale across languages and cultures. So this leads us to a little evaluation table that I'll go back to through this talk. So the first tool that we've been working on for quite a long time is called voice type classification. So it's a bit like talker diarization, except that instead of trying to guess individual speakers, we're going to try to guess classes. And we distinguish key child, other children. So key child is the one wearing the device, other children in the environment, male adults and female adults. So for this particular tool, we used a data set that contained a mixture of different languages. Much of these data are not public because these long-form recordings actually contain much sensitive data, and they cannot be de-identified, so they're not easily shared. Although the data set was cross-linguistic, I draw your attention to the fact that the majority of data actually came from a mean corpus, and this mean corpus had longitudinal data from a small number of children who were taken care of by mainly female adults, which meant that our data set had lots of examples of key child and female adult, but not so many examples of male adult and other children. What I'm going to show you next, however, is when I show you the results, I'm going to show you results for another data set, which was completely held out. in order to show you true generalization beyond the training dev test set that's shown on the top here. But before, let me tell you about the model. As you can see, it was a sequence of neural networks. And the goal of the sequence was to classify individual frames in terms of their likelihood of activation of 5 different classes: key child, other children, male adult, female adult, as well as a speech class, which was on whenever any of the other ones were on. And why do we use these 5 classes? Because it turned out that this performance was better when we used all 5 than when we were trying to predict just one, or when we were just looking at the first 4. In terms of performance, right now, this is still, as far as I know, state of the art. It's the best performance on this kind of data, and we are achieving nearly 70% on the key child and a little above 60% on a completely held out test set. And that seems to us pretty good, given the difficulty even for expert human annotators to get all of these classes with perfect inter-rater reliability. However, if you turn your attention to male, adult, and other children, these are classes in which we need to do more work. We definitely do. And this is something that my lab is working on. We're doing some annotation specifically targeting these classes to have more examples of them, because we think that some of this has to do with algorithm bias, the fact that we have a lot more training data for the other two. So now if we go back to our progress report, our goals of trying to understand language acquisition, what we're going to try to have to do is actually split how well we're doing meeting our goals for adult speech versus other children's speech. As I mentioned, these 2 classes are prevalent in some cultures, so we need to take them into account as potential input for the child. For now, we have a tool that can be used at scale because it's automatized, and it can be used across languages and cultures because we've developed it on the basis of training data that was multilingual. We don't know whether they get these classes accurately enough, although we suspect for other children's speech they're not. I will show in a moment a simulation suggesting that indeed we're right to think that class needs to be improved, whereas the other ones we can live with. So let me show you what I mean by this. This is some work that we're doing with Lucas Gautran and in my lab, and we're doing this in order to have an idea of whether we can stop developing these tools, whether they're good enough for our purposes or not. And so for this, the bar that we're setting is the extent to which they allow us to find a true relationship between how much adults talk and how much children talk in a specific phase. And so the table you see here is each line indicates an annotator who annotated data for a specific experiment. And based on this human annotation, we check what's the false probability of activation of a given class in our voice type classifier that I introduced a moment ago. So the way you read this is that about 4% of adult vocalizations are false positives and that are actually triggered by a child vocalization. And so the next cell tells you that for this particular data set, about 7% of the child vocalizations that the system found were in fact not child vocalizations, but were actually an adult vocalization according to the human annotator. So we then actually perform a simulation by basically creating data where we use as a parameter the strength of the correlation between key child and adult speech. So this is something that we can change, and we make it varied across this whole range. And then we generate data and we measure the strength of correlation in the generated data, which was generated with this strength of correlation at its heart. We have to measure it again because the fact that there's some confusion across the 2 speakers means that the actually measured correlation might not be the same as the correlation that we use to create the data. And in fact, if we have about 15% of confusion, we actually see an overestimation of adult-child correlations. So to make it more concrete, imagine that in a data set, I have about 15% confusion, and I observe a correlation of about 0.3. In this case, the most likely explanation is that actually there is no relationship between how much adults talk and how much the child talks. And basically all the correlation I'm measuring has to do with the confusion between the speakers that the system has. Whereas if I observe a correlation of about 0.7, then I can be pretty sure that there is a true correlation between key child and adult, because even if we are overestimating this correlation a little bit, we're not overestimating a true correlation of 0. In actual reality, the current level of error we have is about 2 to 3%. That's a median error across all of our corpora in the lab. And so that means that the simulation data falls quite close to the idea of no bias, which means that for adult speech, we can stop developing this system because we are measuring it accurately enough for our purposes. However, for other children's speech, we still need to keep going because the error rates are more similar to the 15% I showed you before. Okay, so that was just the first step. The second step is, now that you've separated key child from other people, when you look at speech by other people, you need to decide whether it was directed to a key child versus it was overheard. And this is also something that we did some work on, particularly with colleagues that participated in a compared challenge in 2017. So in this challenge, the corpus was only drawn from English children, and it was relatively small, as you can see here, about 4 hours. The vocalizations were identified using a voice set classifier, not ours, a different one. And then human annotators decided whether it was child-directed versus adult-directed using both the content of what was said and the context. However, for the challenge, these vocalizations were taken out of context and attributed to train dev tests separately. And so that means that the systems didn't have the same information that the human annotators had, because they didn't have the context, because they were taken out of context. And I'll show you the model in a moment, so you can have an idea to what extent we think that they had access to content. So the baseline model for this challenge was a late fusion of 3 different systems. The first one is an end-to-end approach with a series of neural networks. And the second and the third one were based on SVMs, different in terms of the features that the SVM was using. These are the results on a scale, as you can see here at the bottom, in terms of % correct. If we look at the interhuman annotator agreement, when they were given both content and context, it was excellent. It was about 97%. However, this late fusion of the 3 systems I just described, that was the best system with no content or context, which scored about 70%. And I'm talking about this baseline system because even though it's been 4 years, no one at the time and no one ever since has actually beat this baseline. So I'd be very happy to be proven wrong, but for now, this is the best we have. Okay, so this didn't seem very encouraging to us because there was a very large gap in performance between the automated system and the humans, unlike what we saw in voice type classification. And so what we did was an experiment with French listeners. So remember, our stimuli were English. So these listeners had no extensive experience with English, and they did not understand English, so they did not have access to content. In addition, like the system, we played them the clips without context. So they had to make a decision purely based on the acoustic cues in that clip. Now you see the blue at the back, which indicates the distribution of performance in our French listeners. And you see actually the best system from the challenge actually falls right in the distribution of French listeners. So in a way, this shows us that if you don't have access to the content and the context, you basically score at that level. It would have been interesting to test English listeners and give them the clips without context, but so that since they understand the language, they might understand enough of the content. So I didn't do that as an experiment, I just did it myself. And so when I did this, I scored about 80%. So we can have an idea that if we were able to do a system that didn't have access to context, but did have access to content, perhaps we would be able to gain about 10% in performance. But really getting beyond that probably requires processing the clips not outside of content, but actually in their vocalization, in the proper place in the conversational turns. So by now we can go back to our goals. Is it the case that we can say, okay, we're done with child-directed versus overheard? I think that yes, we do have something at scale, but given that the system was developed based on 4 hours of English, I don't think we can say that this is going to work across languages and cultures. I think that there's more work to be done there. Now, very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've done so far. in terms of using speech technology to describe the children's speech. So far, I've been talking simply about quantifying how many vocalizations the child has, but we probably want to separate different kinds of vocalizations. And so this is something that we did also with colleagues in another more recent challenge. In this particular challenge, we were looking at a relatively simple classification of vocalization between crying, laughing, non-canonical and canonical. These two are subtypes of speech-like vocalizations. And so far, we've made a little bit of progress. And in terms of the kinds of models that are being used, some of them are actually beginning to use domain adversarial training or weak supervision. Like in this case, we were using a commercial alternative as a form of getting more data through weak labels. I think that there's a lot to be done more in this domain. Right now, after the challenge, I think the best performance for this 4-class or 5-class classification is about 60%, which is not terrific. And we do better using citizen science approaches. And so in my lab, we're more using that. But if some people are interested in developing classifiers, that would be always welcome. I think there's a lot to be done here, and I'm pointing you here to some recent events in this field. I think there's a lot of promise for the detection of crying from these very noisy recordings. It's really not trivial, and I'm happy that there's a team working on this quite extensively. Other teams have been trying to extract diagnostics, and so looking at large data sets and trying to figure out which children are at risk of being diagnosed with different disorders. Some teams are actually looking at children's production when it's collected in daycares or classrooms, so more noisy settings, which are more difficult than the family-based settings that we've been looking at. And even though ASR is very, very far in the horizon, I did want to point to some of the challenges that have been out more recently, using, of course, more manicured speech and not necessarily the kind of wild speech we see in these long-form recordings. But I think it would be very interesting if we could get ASR for the input, perhaps even for the children's production from here, in the next 10 years. That would be nice, very nice indeed. And so there's one more thing in our, in the whole setup of how do children learn language that we shouldn't forget. I talked to you a lot about the input. I talked to you a little bit about children's production, but I haven't told you anything about the learning function. And if we want to understand language acquisition, then we should look at the learning function too. So this one is a little bit harder, a little bit trickier, and something that is more recent, but I wanted to have a little slide to tell you about it. So with Marvin Lauscha and other colleagues, we have been thinking about this project that we call reverse engineering the learning functions. And the idea here is that we're going to use unsupervised or self-supervised approaches like the one that's shown here. We can vary the kind of input that they have, perhaps provide more versus less input to the systems, and then measure the language outcomes that of this trained system. And so by looking at this, we can actually do sort of proofs of principle. Is it the case that current self-supervised or unsupervised models can actually vary, can actually show us that differences in input composition or input quantity have demonstrable effects on language outcomes? So I think that that's a really interesting endeavor, and I wanted to point out to the Zero Resource Speech Challenge, which has been going on since 2015. And if you haven't come across this, I highly recommend it. I think it's a very exciting direction that could give us a lot of insight as to how children and honestly other agents can learn language. Okay, and so if any of this sounded interesting, I wanted to mention Darko, which is an interdisciplinary community. We have monthly discussions, and often they have to do with tool development, including from speech technology tools. So if any of this sounds interesting, feel free to join in or to send your students and postdocs. We'll be very happy to have you. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alexandra. We will do the usual thing. I will be taking questions from the floor, and then Margaret will be looking at questions which are on the line. So is there any question from the floor? Oh boy, are you afraid to ask? Well, you know, I may have my own sort of question, which is like how far you feel we are from understanding how, I mean, fulfilling your task, which is like how do children acquire the language? Because so far, correct me if I'm entirely wrong, I felt that there is a lot of effort in collecting the data, which of course without the data we cannot get the answer. But it seems like it is already very difficult to collect the data automatically. So almost the question is, I mean, in old days, we wouldn't even think about using any technology. Typically, when the speech researchers, when the female speech researchers get a baby, they got into children acquisition language. And it was done more or less intuitively and by hand. But now I, of course, applaud to this efforts to get it automatically. But how far do you think we are? Because clearly, I mean, if more data we have, more we will know.
Yeah, I think that you point out something very interesting, which is like the composition of the people who study this and what are their motivations. Because indeed, it's traditionally was the case that people would look at the acquisition of their own children and based on that, draw generalizations. But we don't really know whether children of academics develop language in the same way as children everywhere, right? That's an open question.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that the one thing that's been fantastic is I've seen more and more projects like this one being conducted in collaboration with communities. And so I have colleagues who work in sites where the community feels like their children are in a way at a disadvantage when they get to school. And so they want to have programs that help the children get to school with a different skill set. And so this really makes data acquisition much easier because you have the buy-in of the community, at least in the short term. But I think that in terms of data collection, this is definitely something that I think about a lot. In particular, how can we make sure that benefits come back to the communities later on? So that's one way in which, even if we haven't cracked the question of how do children acquire language, maybe there's something useful we can do in the meantime. But I do feel like I agree with you that it feels like we've been working on this for 60 years, and one wonders what has been, what are the new insights. I feel like the development of unsupervised and self-supervised tools can really help us there. Because even if we can't totally be sure that our models represent what human infants do, they can at least tell us what kind of preconditions, prerequisites in the learning functions and in the input you have to have in order for some system, even if it's a non-human system, to learn to process speech and even produce speech at some point.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have some questions from online, so I'll take the first one. This is from Roger Moore. He thanks you for the overview and says, just as it's a gross assumption that children learn speech by being explicitly taught, isn't it also a big assumption that they learn from speech that's directed at them? Being immersed in a multi-party interaction with speech flying around is surely a very rich learning environment, even without active participation.
I completely agree, and this is one of the things that we've been pushing for. It's interesting because when we mention these two sides of the coin, very often we have colleagues who are very invested in positions whereby we can enable parents to provide more enriching environments and so on and so forth. And so they push back and they say, no, directed speech is very important. We have all this correlational research that suggests that what best predicts children's outcomes is directed speech, not only from adults, but mainly from adults. And I should say that this kind of evidence even comes from cultures in which children are very seldom spoken to. So in particular, the study on Yucatec Mayan learning kids who get very little directed speech. And even so, it's that speech that predicts their vocabulary later on, and not overall speech. So that said, perhaps that's a problem in how we've been measuring language acquisition, right? So if you measure just how many words the child understands, perhaps directed speech is the best way to predict it. But if you were to measure something like a skill at maintaining or entering a conversation, then that might actually be better predicted by the number of multi-adic complex conversations that you've observed participating in. So I think that in part it has to do with redefining the metrics of success.
I think we had a question from the floor. Sanjeev, I don't know who has the microphone.
Hello, Alex. I had a technical question. I'm going to go back to some of the technical things. So you talked a fair bit about this voice type classification and then adult versus child-directed speech. I was actually wondering about something more basic, which is just voice activity detection. So first, just a detailed question. In the results you gave us, was there automatic voice activity detection, or did you assume that you knew where the speech was? And regardless of the answer to that, what is the current state in that? What's your feeling? How well does our current technology for speech activity detection work? I mean, are we able to nail down the speech? Because I got the feeling when you were showing us the Watson demo that half the time Watson didn't think it was speech. It was just quietly ignoring it. So, for example, the first time it lost the mother, it was probably because it didn't think it was speech. So anyway, just a question about voice activity detection.
Yeah, so in our approaches, we at some point we were using first voice activity detection and then tokeraterization, and it turned out that that kind of approach, that kind of sequential approach, led to some losses because any errors you have in the first phase they cannot be recovered from, and so that was one of the reasons why Marvin, the person who developed the voice type classifier, also used this class called speech, and so in a way that fifth class called speech is a voice activity detection because it can be on at the same time as the speaker-specific labels, the male adult, female adult, etc. And so in a way, that model already has a voice activity detection system that happens at the same time. So the one way to answer your question about how we're doing in terms of just finding the part that speech, and in particular what you're saying is not ignoring sections that humans recognize as being speech, even though machines find it not very useful, for instance, because it's far away or because it's unusual in its characteristics. I think in general, the patterns of behavior that of performance that we're seeing tend to have quite balanced precision and recall. So we are missing quite a bit of speech, like for instance, in particular, other child and male adult speech. Those recalls are quite low. The recall for female adult and key child are much higher. And in part, this has to do exactly with people who are far afield. And this has two main consequences. One of them is that their voices are softer. And so I think that if we were to use, anytime that we try to use a voice activity detection that came from someone who's like working on meeting speech, for instance, you miss anything that's soft. And then the second reason is that once you are dealing with these softer signals, they are also in acoustic terms, they're also harder to identify as being speech properly. And so one thing that we find very difficult in our wild data sets is that we even have some occasions in which humans spend a long time talking and deciding whether the thing they're hearing is actually an animal or a human. And so when you get to that point, you say, okay, well, this happened to us last week. There were 3 researchers. One of them said human, one of them said animal. And I said, well, I see both of your points. I cannot decide. This is not going to be part of our training set because who knows? So Yeah, so I think that perhaps in voice activity detection, in more manicured settings, I'm not one to say, but I can imagine some people saying that task is solved. But for realistic applications, I think that we have quite a bit of progress to do.
So we have another question from online. This is from Thomas Quattieri. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And he asks, have you or do you plan to apply your methods to speech and language development to children with autism and or who are minimally verbal?
Yeah, that's definitely an area in which I'm working with colleagues on. I think that that's one place where long-form recordings can be very, very useful. So if you've ever worked with populations where speech is very rare, and you're applying, for instance, interventions, and you really want to know whether there's any effect at all, you bring them into a lab, you observe them for 5-10 minutes, an hour, and there's just no production. It's very, very difficult to measure any kind of improvement. And so this is definitely one area in which we're working. And so one of the studies that we carried out was with colleagues in the US who work with a population that's comorbid with autism. So in particular, these were Angelman kids who were diagnosed with Angelman syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder. And so these children were relatively, they spoke a lot less than even controlled children who were much younger. And so to give you an idea, the children in our sample who were diagnosed with Angelman were about 2 years of age, and our control children were about 12 months of age. And even though you have a difference of 1 year, which generally translates with a lot more speech, in this case, they were more or less producing the same amount of vocalization. So, so we can definitely use this technique to build a corpus that better represents the child's abilities because we can sample from a whole day. And so one thing that we did in that study is we tried to look at properties of the vocalization they produced. And in particular, we tried to split them up into crying, laughing versus 2 types of speech-like vocalizations, canonical and non-canonical. And we did that in the lab as well as using a citizen science platform. And I can tell you more details about this citizen science platform. I think it's really an interesting path for speech, for the speech community to take. But in a nutshell, we found that lab annotations and citizen science annotations were equivalent, and they were both sensitive to individual variation and to changes, developmental changes, which were positive in the case of controlled children and negative in the case of Angelman children with losses over age. So I think there's quite a bit of work to do. This is just one example. Some of my colleagues are more interested in early diagnosis. That's a slightly different problem, but definitely it's something that people are working on.
Oh, I'm relieved. Gerard.
So I have a lot of questions, but the main one is about accommodation. In fact, there is evidence that we, of course, as adults, we accommodate with the person we are speaking to. Do you have evidence that the child do the same? And is that interesting for you to take this into account in order to do speech recognition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was really interested in accommodation for a very long time. And we did a study a long time ago trying to look at children who were at risk of autism and children who were not at risk, looking specifically at one specific type of accommodation. So we were looking at prosodic alignment. So the idea that that if you and I are talking, then we might actually, I might raise, well, in this case, I would lower my pitch to come closer to you. And so we looked at pitch height and pitch contour. In a nutshell, what we found in this long-form data was relatively little evidence of accommodation in one direction or the other. By that I mean there was no clear evidence that even the adult was changing their speech in order to resemble the child more. The opposite is less surprising because, of course, these children that we look at are very young. Typically, we look at children who are under 3 years of age. And so it makes more sense that they are unable to control their articulators in order to make these movements. But the fact that adults weren't converging towards the child was surprising. I would love to talk to you about why that might be. My hunch is that it's possible that studies in convergence do not have a lot of prediction in terms of real convergence in the real world. And I know that there are some colleagues looking even at adults, for instance, people who spend a lot of time together in reality shows, finding little evidence of convergence in real life situations, in big data from real life. So I don't know, one possibility is that indeed convergence in the wild doesn't exist. Another possibility is that we just missed it.
We can take.
So.
Just to mention that we did such an experiment where we study convergence within the family. So my point is that we do converge when you know, in fact, so you have internal representation of the phonetic coverage of your interlocutor. So we observe this somehow the use of the degrees of convergence within the family, so between children, between the children with the adult. Yeah, there is a debate about is that automatic or is that controlled for social purpose to diverge or converge towards. So it's interesting, in fact, to have data on young children to see if how do they master this to indicate the degree of intimacy they want to create with the addressee. So that was my question, in fact. So you can sometimes diverge or you can converge depending on your needs, somehow.
Yeah. I wonder, so the convergence you did find, did you find it in this kind of like completely ecological data, or did you find it in, did you set up an elicitation protocol?
They were playing games, so it's
so
you have to have some kind of a common task. So it's of course at home playing games and favoring of course also verbal interaction because so it's a problem, a large problem of what is the context, how you control the context. And my second question was about multimodal input. In fact, explaining everything from verbal input, from the speech signal is perhaps very difficult. Gaze, hand gestures, they are performing a lot of hand gestures. So are you planning also to take this into account in your analysis?
Yeah, no, I personally don't collect multimodal data. In part, it's because of resistance. That these are basically you have a spy who's in your home, and so I found that parents are quite resistant to that kind of data in these large scales. So I don't push for it, but I do have colleagues who are collecting this data. So in particular, there's a new lab in the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. And they're collecting audio-video data using basically police cams that are still child-centered. And so some of those data could be informative for people who are interested in gestures and so on. Although access to those data will be a little bit tricky for the same reasons I mentioned, because parents are concerned about who has access to it and how it's used.
Well, fortunately, you two are from the same country, right? And Grenoble and Paris is not too far, so I'm sure we will get together. I think we have one more question.
Yes, we have a question from Moritz Jakob, and he asks, some of the wearable audio recording systems give researchers metrics like word counts, vocalization counts, turn counts, etc. I'm curious about how detailed the output of such systems is. Are there also systems that can provide prosodic information, for example, F0 related, of individual speakers to the researchers, or potentially even first annotations, for example, information about who speaks of audio files?
Yeah, so the most commonly used system is called Lina, and it was developed by a foundation, and they're interested in very broad metrics. And so what they return is indeed just child vocalization counts. They also return a transcription, like an automated annotation of the whole day long wrecording. And so you can extract information about, for instance, turns, who who speaks when, what are the typical inter-turn intervals and things like that. So that's the kind of system that it's plug and play, and then you get all of this data. In this case, you don't get anything like F0. You don't get any kind of phonetic description. However, there's now open source alternatives for basically all the things that Lina does. And if you get the link to my slides, then you'll find links to those tools too. And in that case, then you can do, it's relatively easy to set up analysis in which you extract, for instance, F0 of the different speakers. So it's definitely technically possible today.
And I'll just mention for the people in the room who may not have seen, Alex has posted a link to her slides in the question list in the online platform, so you can go there and find her slides.
So I was afraid that we will run out of time, but if there is a burning last question from the floor, there is one in the back.
Hi, thank you. My question is, do we have any objective measures on saying how children acquire a language as a humans? Can we know? And the following question is, if we understand how children acquire language, or if we don't understand, will it be helpful by collecting more data? Will we be able to answer this?
Yeah, such a good question. So I'll keep it very brief. I think that this is a fantastic question, and if you're interested in connecting with me, I'd be happy to talk about it more. But one thing that I've been trying to push as an idea is that instead of creating basically tasks that we believe reflect language, like word comprehension experiments, that basically take the child out of it, or the person outside of their everyday reality. My proposal now is that we try to study, using these long-form recordings, to what extent children's individual behavior resembles that of adults in the same setting. And so instead of us defining what is language performance, we try to use the same data to benchmark children against children who are older or adults in the same environment. So I guess that's the nice thing about my answer, is that it's an answer for both of your questions. So I'm hoping that the data will give us an answer to, more data will give us an answer to how we establish that someone has learned the language.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that if we run any longer, we will run into the lunch. So I think we would like to thank to Alexandra and close the floor if I have agreement from my co-chair. Okay, thank you very much, and we will see you in an hour.